Chapter 5 of Different Girls. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Different Girls, Harper's Novelettes. His Sister by Mary Applewhite Bacon. But you couldn't see me leave, Mother, anyway, unless I was there to go. It was characteristic of the girl, adjusting her new travelling hat before the dim little looking-glass, that, while her heart was beating with excitement which was strangely like grief, she could give herself at once to her stepmother's inquietude and turn it aside with a jest. Mrs. Morgan, arrested in her anxious movement towards the door, stood for a moment taking in the reasonableness of Stella's proposition, and then sank back to the edge of her chair. "The train gets here at 2:00, she argued. Lindsay Howard came into the room, his head bent over the satchel he had been mending. "You had better say good-bye to Stella here at the house, Mother," he suggested. "There's no use for you to walk down to the depot in the hot sun." And then he noticed that his stepmother had on her bonnet with the veil to it. She had married since his father's death, and was again a widow, and in extreme disregard of the September heat was dressed in the black worsted of a diagonal weave which she wore only on occasions which demanded some special tribute to their importance. She began smoothing out on her knees the black gloves which, in her nervous haste to be going, she had been holding squeezed in a tight ball in her left hand. "I can get there, I reckon," she answered with mild brevity, and as if the young man's words had barely grazed her consciousness. A moment later she went to the window, and, with her back to Lindsay, poured the contents of a small leather purse into one hand and began to count them softly. He looked up again. "I'm going to pay for Stella's ticket, Mother. You must not do it," he said. She replaced the money immediately, but without impatience, and as acquiescing in his assumption of his sister's future. "You've done so much already," he apologized, but he knew that she was hurt, and chafed to feel that only the irrational thing on his part would have seemed to her the kind one. Stella turned from the verdict of the dim looking-glass upon her appearance to that of her brother's face. As she stood there in that moment of pause, she might have been the type of all innocent and budding life. The delicacy of floral bloom was in the fine texture of her skin, the purple of dewy violets in her soft eyes, and this new access of sadness, which was as yet hardly conscious of itself, had thrown over the natural gaiety of her young girlhood something akin to the pathetic tenderness which veils the earth in the dawn of a summer morning. He felt it to be so, but dimly, and, young himself, and already strained by the exactions of personal desires, he answered only the look of inquiry in her face. "Will the merchants here never learn any taste in dry goods?" Instantly he was sick with regret. Of what consequence was the too pronounced blue of her dress in comparison with the light of happiness in her dear face? How impossible for him to be here for even these few hours without running counter to some cherished illusion or dear habit of speech or manner. "I tell you it's time we were going," Mrs. Morgan appealed, her anxiety returning. "We have 35 minutes yet," Lindsay said, looking at his watch, but he gathered up the bags and umbrellas and followed as she moved ponderously to the door. Stella waited until they were out in the hall, and then looked around the room, a poignant tenderness in her eyes. There was nothing congruous between its shabby walls and cheap worn furniture and her own beautiful young life, but the heart establishes its own relations, and tears rose suddenly to her eyes and fell in quick succession. Even so brief a farewell was broken in upon by her stepmother's call, and pressing her wet cheek for a moment against the discoloured door facing, she hurried out to join her. Lindsay did not at first connect the unusual crowd in and around the little station with his sister's departure, but the young people at once formed a circle around her, into which one and another older person entered and retired again with about the same expressions of affectionate regret and good wishes. He had known them all so long, but, except for the growing up of the younger boys and girls during his 5 years of absence, they were to him still what they had been since he was a child, affecting him still with the old depressing sense of distance and dislike. The grammarless speech of the men, the black-rimmed nails of Stella's schoolmaster, a good classical scholar, but heedless as he was good-hearted, jarred upon him indeed with the discomfort of a new experience. Upon his own slender, erect figure, clothed in poor but well-fitting garments, gentleman was written as plainly as in words, just as idealist was written on his forehead and the other features which thought had chiselled perhaps too finely for his years. The brightness had come back to Stella's face, and he could not but feel grateful to the men who had left their shops and dingy little stores to bid her good-bye, and to the placid, kindly-faced women ranged along the settees against the wall and conversing in low tones about how she would be missed. But the noisy flock of young people, who, with their chorus of expostulations, assurances, and prophecies, seemed to make her one of themselves, filled him with strong displeasure. He knew how foolish it would be for him to show it, but he could get no further in his effort at concealment than a cold silence, which was itself significant enough. A tall youth with bold and handsome features and a pretty girl in a showy red muslin ignored him altogether, with a pride which really quite overmatched his own, but the rest shrank back a little as he passed, looking after the checks and tickets, either cutting short their sentences at his approach or missing the point of what they had to say. The train seemed to him long in coming. His stepmother moved to the end of the settee and made a place for him at her side. "Lindsay," she said, under cover of the talk and laughter, and speaking with some difficulty, "I hope you will be able to carry out all your plans for yourself and Stella, but while you're making the money, she will have to make the friends. Don't you ever interfere with her doing it. From what little I have seen of the world, it's going to take both to carry you through." His face flushed a little, but he recognized her faithfulness and did it honour. "That is true, mother, and I will remember what you say. But I have some friends," he added in enforced self-vindication, "in Vaucluse, if not here." A whistle sounded up the road. She caught his hand with a swift accession of tenderness towards his youth. "You've done the best you could, Lindsay," she said. "I wish you well, my son. I wish you well." There were tears in her eyes. George Morrow and the girl in red followed Stella into the car, not at all disconcerted at having to get off after the train was in motion. "Don't forget me, Stella," the girl called back. "Don't you ever forget Ida Brand." There was a waving of hands and handkerchiefs from the little station, a glare in the early afternoon sun. A few moments later the train had rounded a curve, shutting the meagre village from sight, and, to Lindsay Cowart's thought, shutting it into a remote past as well. He arose and began rearranging their luggage. "Do you want these?" he inquired, holding up a bouquet of dahlias, scarlet sage, and purple petunias, and thinking of only one answer as possible. "I will take them," she said, as he stood waiting her formal consent to drop them from the car window. Her voice was quite as usual, but something in her face suggested to him that this going away from her childhood's home might be a different thing to her from what he had conceived it to be. He caught the touch of tender vindication in her manner as she untied the cheap red ribbon which held the flowers together and rearranged them into 2 bunches so that the jarring colours might no longer offend, and felt that the really natural thing for her to do was to weep, and that she only restrained her tears for his sake. 16 was so young. His heart grew warm and brotherly towards her youth and inexperience, but, after all, how infinitely better that she should have cause for this passing sorrow. He left her alone, but not for long. He was eager to talk with her of the plans about which he had been writing her the 2 years since he himself had been a student at Vaucluse, of the future which they should achieve together. It seemed to him only necessary for him to show her his point of view, to have her adopt it as her own, and he believed, building on her buoyancy and responsiveness of disposition, that nothing he might propose would be beyond the scope of her courage. "It may be a little lonely for you at first," he told her. "There are only a handful of women students at the college, and all of them much older than you. But it is your studies at last that are the really important thing, and I will help you with them all I can. Mrs. Bancroft will have no other lodgers, and there will be nothing to interrupt our work." "And the money, Lindsay?" she asked a little anxiously. "What I have will carry us through this year. Next summer we can teach and make almost enough for the year after. The trustees are planning to establish a fellowship in Greek, and if they do, and I can secure it, and Professor Wayland thinks I can, that will make us safe the next 2 years, until you are through." "And then?" He straightened up buoyantly. "Then your 2 years at Vassar, and mine at Harvard, with some teaching thrown in along the way, of course. And then Europe, Greece, all the great things." She smiled with him in his enthusiasm. "You are used to such bold thoughts. It is too high a flight for me all at once." "It will not be a year from now," he declared confidently. A silence fell between them, and the noise of the train made a pleasant accompaniment to his thoughts as he sketched in detail the work of the coming months. But always as a background to his hopes was that honourable social position which he meant eventually to achieve, the passion for which was part of his Southern inheritance. Little as he had yet participated in any interests outside his daily tasks, he had perceived in the old college town its deeply grained traditions of birth and custom, perceived and respected them, and discounted the more their absence in the sorry village he had left. Sometime, when he should assail it, the exclusiveness of his new environment might beat him back cruelly, but thus far it existed for him only as a barrier to what was ultimately precious and desirable. One day the gates would open at his touch, and he and the sister of his heart should enter their rightful heritage. The afternoon waned. He pointed outside the car window. "See how different all this is from the part of the state which we have left," he said. "The landscape is still rural, but what mellowness it has, because it has been enriched by a larger, more generous human life. One can imagine what this whole section must have been in those old days, before the coming of war and desolation, and Vaucluse was the flower, the centre of it all." His eye kindled. "Some day external prosperity will return, and then Vaucluse and her ideals will be needed more than ever. it is she who must hold in check the commercial spirit and dominate, as she has always done, the material with the intellectual." There was a noble emotion in his face, reflecting itself in the younger countenance beside his own. Poor, young, unknown, their hearts thrilled with pride in their state, with the possibility that they also should give to her of their best when the opportunity should be theirs. "It is a wonderful old town," Lindsay went on again. "Even Wayland says so, our Greek professor, you know." His voice thrilled with the devotion of the hero worshipper as he spoke the name. "He is a Harvard man, and has seen the best of everything, and even he has felt the charm of the place. He told me so. You will feel it too. It is just as if the little town and the college together had preserved in amber all that was finest in our Southern life. And now to think you and I are to share in all its riches." His early consecration to such a purpose, the toil and sacrifice by which it had been achieved, came movingly before her, yet, mingled with her pride in him, something within her pleaded for the things which he rated so low. "It used to be hard for you at home, Lindsay," she said softly. "Yes, it was hard." His face flushed. "I never really lived till I left there. I was like an animal caught in a net, like a man struggling for air. You can't know what it is to me now to be with people who are thinking of something else than of how to make a few dollars in a miserable country store." "But they were good people in Bowersville, Lindsay," she urged, with gentle loyalty. "I am sure they were, if you say so," he agreed. "But at any rate we are done with it all now." He laid his hand over hers. "At last I am going to take you into our own dear world." It was, after all, a very small world as to its actual dimensions, but to the brother it had the largeness of opportunity, and to Stella it seemed infinitely complex. She found security at first only in following minutely the programme which Lindsay had laid out for her. It was his own as well, and simple enough. Study was the supreme thing. Exercise came in as a necessity, pleasure only as the rarest incident. She took all things cheerfully, after her nature, but after 2 or 3 months the colour began to go from her cheeks, the elasticity from her step. Nor was her class standing, though creditable, quite what her brother had expected it to be. Wayland detained him one day in his classroom. "Do you think your sister is quite happy here, coward?" he asked. The boy thrilled, as he always did at any special evidence of interest from such a source. But he had never put this particular question to himself, and had no reply at hand. "I have never thought this absolute surrender to books the wisest thing for you," Wayland went on. "But for your sister it is impossible. She was formed for companionship, for happiness, not for the isolation of the scholar. Why did you not put her into one of the girls' schools of the state, where she would have had associations more suited to her years?" he asked bluntly. Lindsay could scarcely believe that he was listening to the young professor whose scholarly attainments seemed to him the sum of what was most desirable in life. "Our girls' colleges are very superficial," he answered, "and even if they were not, she could get no Greek in any of them." "My dear boy," Wayland said, "the amount of Greek which your sister knows or doesn't know will always be a very unimportant matter. She has things that are so infinitely more valuable to give to the world, and deserves so much better things for herself," he added, drawing together his text for the next recitation. Lindsay returned to Mrs. Bancroft's quiet, old-fashioned house in a sort of daze. "Stella," he said, "do you think you enter enough into the social side of our college life?" "No," she answered, "but I think neither of us does." "Well, leave me out of the count. If I get through my junior year as I ought, I am obliged to grind, and when there is any time left, I feel that I must have it for reading in the library. But it needn't be so with you. Didn't an invitation come to you for the reception Friday evening?" Her face grew wistful. "I don't care to go to things, Lindsay, unless you will go with me," she said. Nevertheless, he had his way, and when once she made it possible, opportunities for social pleasures poured in upon her. As Wayland had said, she was formed for friendship, for joy, and that which was her own came to her unsought. She was by nature too simple and sweet to be spoiled by the attention she received. The danger perhaps was the less because she missed in it all the comradeship of her brother, without which in her eyes the best things lost something of their charm. It was not merely personal ambition which kept him at his books. The passion of the scholar was upon him, and made him count all moments lost that were spent away from them. Sometimes Stella sought him as he pored over them alone, and putting her arm shyly about him, would beg that he would go with her for a walk or a ride on the river. But almost always his answer was the same: "I am so busy, Stella dear. If you knew how much I have to do, you would not even ask me." There was one interruption, indeed, which the young student never refused. Sometimes their Greek professor dropped in at Mrs. Bancroft's to bring or to ask for a book. Sometimes, with the lovely coming of the spring, he would join them as they were leaving the college grounds, and lead them away into some of the woodland walks, rich in wild flowers, that environed the little town. Such hours seemed to both brother and sister to have a flavour, a brightness, quite beyond what ordinary life could give. Wayland, too, must have found in them his own share of pleasure, for he made them more frequent as the months went by. It was in the early spring of her second year at Vaucluse that the accident occurred. The poor lad who had taken her out in the boat was almost beside himself with grief and remorse. "We had enjoyed the afternoon so much," he said, trying to tell how it had happened. "I thought I had never seen her so happy, so gay. But you know she was that always. It was nearly sunset, and I remember how she spoke of the light as we saw it through the open spaces of the woods, and as it slanted across the water. Farther down the river the yellow jasmine was beginning to open. A beech tree that leaned out over the water was hung with it. She wanted some, and I guided the boat under the branches. I meant to get it for her myself, but she was reaching up after it almost before I knew it. The bough that had the finest blossoms on it was just beyond her reach, and while I steadied the boat, she pulled it towards her by one of the vines hanging from it. She must have put too much weight on it. It all happened so quickly. I called to her to be careful, but while I was saying the words the vine snapped, and she fell back with such force that the boat tipped, and in a second we were both in the water. I knew I could not swim, but I hoped that the water so near the bank would be shallow, and it was. But there was a deep hole under the roots of the tree." He could get no further. Poor lad! The wonder was that he had not been drowned himself. A negro ploughing in the field near by saw the accident and ran to his help, catching him as he was sinking for the third time. Stella never rose after she went down. Her clothing had been entangled in the roots of the beech. Sorrow for the young life cut off so untimely was deep and universal. and sought to manifest itself in tender ministrations to the brother so cruelly bereaved. But Lindsay shrank from all offices of sympathy, and except for seeking, now and then, Wayland's silent companionship, bore his grief alone. The college was too poor to establish the fellowship in Greek, but the adjunct professor in mathematics resigned, and young Cowart was elected to his place, with the proviso that he give 2 months' further study to the subject in the summer school of some university. Wayland decided which, by taking him back with him to Cambridge, where he showed the boy an admirable friendship. Lindsay applied himself to his special studies with the utmost diligence. It was impossible, moreover, that his new surroundings should not appeal to his tastes in many directions. But, in spite of his response to these larger opportunities, his friend discerned that the wound which the young man kept so carefully hidden had not, after all these weeks, begun even slightly to heal. Late on an August night, impelled as he often was to share the solitude which Lindsay affected, he sought him at his lodgings, and not finding him, followed what he knew was a favourite walk with the boy, and came upon him half hidden under the shadows of an elm in the woods that skirted Mount Auburn. "I thought you might be here," he said, taking the place that Lindsay made for him on the seat. Many words were never necessary between them. The moon was full and the sky cloudless, and for some time they sat in silence, yielding to the tranquil loveliness of the scene, and to that inner experience of the soul brooding over each, and more inscrutable than the fathomless vault above them. "I suppose we shall never get used to a midnight that is still and at the same time lustrous, as this is tonight," Wayland said. "The sense of its uniqueness is as fresh whenever it is spread before us as if we had never seen it before." It was but a part of what he meant. He was thinking how sorrow, the wide sense of personal loss, was in some ways like the pervasiveness, the voiceless speech, of this shadowed radiance around them. He drew a little nearer the relaxed and slender figure beside his own. "It is of her you are thinking, Lindsay," he said gently, and mentioning for the first time the young man's loss. "All that you see seems saturated with her memory. I think it will always be so. Scenes of exceptional beauty, moments of high emotion, will always bring her back." The boy's response came with difficulty. "Perhaps so. I do not know. I think the thought of her is always with me." "If so, it should be for strength, for comfort," his friend pleaded. "She herself brought only gladness wherever she came." There was something unusual in his voice, something that for a moment raised a vague questioning in Lindsay's mind. But, absorbed as he was in his own sadness, it eluded his feeble inquiry. To what Wayland had said he could make no reply. "Perhaps it is the apparent waste of a life so beautiful that seems to you so intolerable." He felt the strong man's impulse to arrest an irrational grief, and groped for the assurance he desired. "Yet, Lindsay, we know things are not wasted, not in the natural world, not in the world of the spirit." But on the last words his voice lapsed miserably, and he half rose to go. Lindsay caught his arm and drew him back. "Don't go yet," he said brokenly. "I know you think it would help me if I would talk about Stella, if I should tell it all out to you. I thank you for being willing to listen. Perhaps it will help me." He paused, seeking for some words in which to express the sense of poverty which scourged him. Of all who had loved his sister, he himself was left poorest. Others had taken freely of her friendship, had delighted themselves in her face, her words, her smile, had all these things for memories. He had been separated from her, in part by the hard conditions of their youth, and at last, when they had been together, by his own will. Oh, what had been her inner life during these last 2 years, when it had gone on beside his own, while he was too busy to attend! But the self-reproach was too bitter for utterance to even the kindest of friends. "I thought I could tell you," he said at last, "but I can't. Oh, Professor Wayland," he cried, "there is an element in my grief that is peculiar to itself, that no one else in sorrow ever had." "I think every mourner on earth would say that, Lindsay." Again the younger man discerned the approach of a mystery, but again he left it unchallenged. The professor rose to his feet. "Good night," he said, "unless you will go back with me. Even with such moonlight as this, one must sleep." He had dropped to that kind level of the commonplace by which we spare ourselves and one another. "Where the love light never, never dies." The boy's voice, ringing out blithely through the drip and dampness of the winter evening, marked his winding route across the college grounds. Lindsay Cowart, busy at his study table, listened without definite effort, and placed the singer as the lad newly come from the country. He could have identified any other of the Vaucluse students by connections as slight. Marchman by his whistling, tender, elusive sounds, flute notes sublimated, heard only when the night was late and the campus still. Others by tricks of voice, fragments of laughter, by their footfalls even, on the narrow brick walk below his study window. Such the easy proficiency of affection. Attention to the lad's singing suddenly was lifted above the subconscious. The simple melody had entangled itself in some forgotten association of the professor's boyhood, seeking to marshal which before him, he received the full force of the single line sung in direct earshot. Like the tune, the words also became a challenge, pricked through the unregarded heaviness in which he was plying his familiar task, and demanded that he should name its cause. For him, the love light of his marriage had been dead so long. No, not dead, nothing so dignified, so tragic. Burnt down, smouldered, suffocated by the hateful dust of the commonplace. There was a touch of contempt in the effort with which he dismissed the matter from his mind and turned back to his work. And yet, he stopped a moment longer to think. For him, life without the light of love fell so far below its best achievement. The front of his desk was covered with the papers in mathematics over which he had spent his evenings for more than a week. Most of them had been corrected and graded, with the somewhat full comment or elucidation here and there which had made his progress slow. He examined a half-dozen more, and then, in sheer mental revolt against the subject, slipped them under the rubber bands with others of their kind, and dropped the neat packages out of his sight into one of the drawers of the desk. Wayland's book on Greece, the fruit of 18 months' sojourn there, had come through the mail on the same day when the calculus papers had been handed in, and he had read it through at once, not to be teased intolerably by its invitation. He had mastered the text, avid through the long winter night, but he picked it up again now, and for a little while studied the sumptuous illustrations. How long Wayland had been away from Vaucluse, how much of enrichment had come to him in the years since he had left. He himself might have gone also, to larger opportunities. He had chosen to remain, held by a sentiment. The professor closed the book with a little sigh, and, taking it to a small shelf on the opposite side of the room, stood it with a half-dozen others worthy of such association. Returning, he got together before him the few Greek authors habitually in hand's reach, whether handled or not, and from a compartment of his desk took out several sheets of manuscript, metrical translations from favourite passages in the tragedies or the short poems of the Anthology. Like the rest of the Vaucluse professors, a mere handful they were, he was straitened by the hard exactions of classroom work, and the book, which he hoped some time to publish, grew slowly. How far he was in actual miles from the men who were getting their thoughts into print! How much farther in environment! Things which to them were the commonplaces of a scholar's life were to him impossible luxuries. Few even of their books found their way to his shelves. At least the original sources of inspiration were his, and sometimes he felt that his verses were not without spirit, flavour. He took up a little volume of Theocritus, which opened easily at the seventh idyl, and began to read aloud. Half-way through the poem the door opened, and his wife entered. He did not immediately adjust himself to the interruption, and she remained standing a few moments in the centre of the room. "Thank you, I believe I will be seated," she said, the sarcasm in her words carefully excluded from her voice. He wondered that she should find interest in so sorry a game. "I thought you felt enough at home in here to sit down without being asked," he said, rising and trying to speak lightly. She took the rocking chair he brought for her, and leaned back in it without speaking. Her maroon-coloured evening gown suggested that whoever planned it had been somewhat straitened by economy, but it did well by her rich complexion and creditable figure. Her features were creditable too, the dark hair a little too heavy, perhaps, and the expression, defined as it is apt to be when one is 35, not wholly satisfying. In truth, the countenance, like the gown, suffered a little from economy, a sparseness of the things one loves best in a woman's face. Half the sensitiveness belonging to her husband's eyes and mouth would have made her beautiful. "It is a pity the Barkers have such a bad night for their party," Cowart said. "The reception is at the Fieldings," and again he felt himself rebuked. "I'm afraid I didn't think much about the matter after you told me the Dillinghams were coming by for you in their carriage. Fortunately, neither family holds us college people to very strict social account. They have their virtues, even if they are so vulgar as to be rich. Why, I believe I had just been thinking, before you came in, that it is only the rich who have any virtues at all." He managed to speak genially, but the consciousness that she was waiting for him to make conversation, as she had waited for the chair, stiffened upon him like frost. He cast about for something to say, but the one interest which he would have preferred to keep to himself was all that presented itself to his grasp. "I have often thought," he suggested, "that if only we were in sight of the Gulf, our landscape in early summer might not be very unlike that of ancient Greece." She looked at him a little blankly, and he drew one of his books nearer and began turning its leaves. "I thought you were correcting your mathematics papers." "I am, or have been, but I am reading Theocritus too." "Well, I don't see anything in a day like this to make anybody think of summer. The dampness goes to your very marrow." "It isn't the day, it's the poetry. That's the good of there being poetry." She skipped his parenthesis. "And you keep this room as cold as a vault." Not fault-finding, but a somewhat irritating concern for his comfort was in the complaint. She went to the hearth, and in her efficient way shook down the ashes from the grate and heaped it with coal. A cabinet photograph of a girl in her early teens, which had the appearance of having just been put there, was supported against a slender glass vase. Mrs. Cowart took it up and examined it critically. "I don't think this picture does Arnoldina justice," she said. "One of the eyes seemed to droop a little, and the mouth looks sad. Arnoldina never did look sad." They were on common ground now, and he could speak without constraint. "I hadn't observed that it looked sad. She seems somehow to have got a good deal older since September." "She is maturing, of course." All a mother's pride and approbation were in the reserve of the speech. To have put more definitely her estimate of the sweet young face would have been a clumsy thing in comparison. Lindsay's countenance lighted up. He arose, and standing by his wife, looked over her shoulder as she held the photograph to the light. "Do you know, Gertrude," he said, "there is something in her face that reminds me of Stella?" "I don't know that I see it," she answered indifferently, replacing the photograph and returning to her chair. The purpose which had brought her to the room rose to her face. "I stopped at the warehouse this afternoon," she said, "and had a talk with father. Jameson really goes to Mobile the 1st of next month. The place is open to you if you want it." "But, Gertrude, how should I possibly want it?" he expostulated. "You would be a member of the firm. You might as well be making money as the rest of them." He offered no comment. "It is not now like it was when you were made professor. The town has become a commercial centre, and its educational interests have declined. The professors will always have their social position, of course, but they cannot hope for anything more. It is not merely Vaucluse, but the South, that is passing into this phase. But economic independence has become a necessity. When once it is achieved, our people will turn to higher things. Not soon enough to benefit you and me." "Probably not. Then why waste your talents on the college when the best years of your life are still before you?" "I'm not teaching for money, Gertrude." He hated putting into the bald phrase his consecration to his ideals for the young men of his state. He hated putting it into words at all, but something in his voice told her that the argument was finished. There was a sound of carriage wheels on the drive. He arose and began to assist her with her wraps. "It is too bad for you to be dependent on even such nice escorts as the Dillinghams are," he solaced, recovering himself. "We college folk are a sorry lot." But when she was gone, the mood for composition, which an hour before had seemed so near, had escaped him, and he put away his books and manuscript, standing for a while, a little chilled in mind and body, before the grate, and looking at the photograph on the mantel. While he did so, the haunting likeness he had seen grew more distinct, and by degrees another face overspread that of his young daughter, the face of the sister he had loved and lost. With a sudden impulse he crossed the room to an old-fashioned mahogany secretary, opened its slanting lid, and unlocking, with some difficulty, a small inner drawer, returned with it to his desk. Several packages of letters, tied with faded ribbon, filled the small receptacle, but they struck upon him with the strangeness of something utterly forgotten. The pieces of ribbon had once held for him each its own association of time or place. Now he could only remember, looking down upon them with tender gaze, that they had been Stella's, worn in her hair, or at her throat or waist. Simple and inexpensive he saw they were. Arnoldina would not have looked at them. Overcoming something of reluctance, he took one of the packages from its place. It contained the letters he had found in her writing table after her death, most of them written after she had come to Vaucluse, by her stepmother and the friends she had left in the village. He knew there was nothing in any of them she would have withheld from him. In reading them he was merely taking back something from the vanished years which, if not looked at now, would perish utterly from earth. How affecting they were, these utterances of true and humble hearts, written to one equally true and good. His youth and hers in the remote country village rose before him, not now, as once, pinched and narrow, but as salutary, even gracious. He could but feel how changed his standards had become since then, how different his measure of the great and the small of life. Suddenly, as he was thus borne back into the past, the old sorrow sprang upon him, and he bowed before it. The old bitter cry, which he had been able to utter to no human consoler, swept once more to his lips. "Oh, Stella, Stella, you died before I really knew you, your brother, who should have known and loved you best, and now it is too late, too late." He sent out, as of old, his voiceless call to one afar off, in some land where her whiteness, her budding soul, had found their rightful place. But even as he did so, his thought of her seemed to be growing clearer. From that far, reverenced, but unimagined sphere, she was coming back to the range of his apprehension, to comradeship in the life in which they once had shared together. He trembled with the hope of a fuller attainment. Lifting his bowed head and taking another package of the letters from their place, her letters. He had begged them of her friends in his desperate sense of ignorance, his longing to make good something of all that he had lost in those last 2 years of her life. What an innocent life it was that was spread before him, and how young, oh, how young! And it was a happy life. He was astonished, after all his self-reproach, to realize how happy, to find himself smiling with her in some girlish drollery, such as used to come so readily to her lips. He could detect, too, how the note of gladness, how her whole life, indeed, had grown richer in the larger existence of Vaucluse. At last he could be comforted that, however it had ended, it was he who had made it hers. He had been feeding eagerly, too eagerly, and under the pressure of emotion was constrained to rise and walk the floor, sinking at last into his armchair and gazing with unseeing eyes upon the ruddy coals in the grate. That lovely life, which he had thought could never in its completeness be his, was rebuilt before his vision from the materials which she herself had left. What he had believed to be loss, bitter, unspeakable even to himself, had in these few hours of the night become wealth. His quickened thought moved on from plane to plane. He scanned the present conditions of his life and saw with clarified vision how good they were. What it was given to him to do for his students, at least what he was trying to do for them, the preciousness of their regard, the long friendship with his colleagues, the associations with the little community in which his lot was cast, limited in some directions as they might be, the fair domain of Greek literature, in which his feet were so much at home, his own literary gift, even if a slender one, his dear, dear child. And Gertrude, under the invigoration of his mood, a situation which had long seemed unamenable to change, resolved itself into new and simpler proportions. The worthier aspects of his home life, the finer traits of his wife's character, stood before him as proofs of what might yet be. His memory had kept no record of the fact that when, in the first year of his youthful sorrow, sick for comfort and believing her all tenderness, he had married her, to find her impatient of his grief, nor of the many times since when she had appeared almost wilfully blind to his ideals and purposes. His judgment held only this, that she had never understood him. For this he had seldom blamed her, but tonight he blamed himself. Instead of shrinking away sensitively, keeping the vital part of his life to himself, and making what he could of it alone, he should have set himself steadily to create a place for it in her understanding and sympathy. Was not a perfect married love worth the minor sacrifices as well as the supreme surrender from which he believed that neither of them would have shrunk? He returned to his desk and began to rearrange the contents of the little drawer. Among them was a small sandalwood box, which had been their mother's, and which Stella had prized with special fondness. He had never opened it since her death, but as he lifted it now, the frail clasp gave way, the lid fell back, and the contents slipped upon the desk. There were few: a ring, a thin gold locket containing the miniatures of their father and mother, a small tintype of himself, taken when he first left home, and 2 or 3 notes addressed in handwriting which he recognized as Wayland's. He replaced them with reverent touch, turning away, even in thought, from what he had never meant to see. By and by he heard in the distance the roll of carriages returning from the Fieldings' reception. He replenished the fire generously, found a long cloak in the closet at the end of the hall, and awaited the sound of wheels before his own door. "The rain has grown heavier," he said, drawing the cloak around his wife as she descended from the carriage. Something in his manner seemed to envelop her. He brought her into the study and seated her before the fire. She had expected to find the house silent. The glow and warmth of the room were grateful after the chill and darkness outside. Her husband's presence, after that vague sense of futility which the evening's gaiety had left upon her. "I suppose I ought to tell you about the party," she said, a little wearily. "But if you don't mind, I will wait till breakfast. Everybody was there, of course, and it was all very fine, as we all knew it would be. I hope you've enjoyed your Latin poets more." "They are Greek, dear," he said. "I have been making translations from some of them now and then. Some day we will take a day off, and then I'll read them to you. But neither the party nor the poets tonight. See, it is almost 2 o'clock." "I knew it must be late, but you look as fresh as a child that has just waked from sleep." "Perhaps I have just waked." They rose to go upstairs. "I will go in front and make a light in our room while you turn off the gas in the hall." He paused for a moment after she had gone out, and turned to a page in the Greek Anthology for a single stanza. Shelley's translation was written in pencil beside it. "Thou wert the morning star among the living, ere thy fair light had fled. Now having died thou art as Hesperus giving new splendour to the dead." End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Different Girls. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eva Davis. Different Girls, Harper's Novelettes. The Perfect Year by Eleanor A. Hallowell. When Dolly Leonard died, on the night of my debutante party, our little community was aghast. If I live to be 1,000, I shall never outgrow the paralyzing shock of that disaster. I think that the girls of our younger set never fully recovered from it. It was 6 o'clock when we got the news. Things had been jolly and bustling all afternoon. The house was filled with florists and caterers, and I had gone to my room to escape the final responsibilities of the occasion. There were 7 of us girl chums dressing in my room, and we were lolling round in various stages of lace and ruffles when the doorbell rang. Partly out of consideration for the tired servants, and partly out of nervous curiosity incited by the day's influx of presents and bouquets, I slipped into my pink eiderdown wrapper and ran down to the door. The hall was startlingly sweet with roses. Indeed, the whole house was a perfect bower of leaf and blossom, and I suppose I did look elfish as I ran, for a gruff old workman peered up at me and smiled, and muttered something about pinky posy, and I know it did not seem impertinent to me at the time. At the door, in the chill blast of the night, stood our little old grey postman with some letters in his hand. "Oh," I said, disappointed, "just letters." The postman looked at me a trifle queerly. I thought it was my pink wrapper. And he said, "Don't worry about just letters. Dolly Leonard is dead." "Dead?" I gasped. "Dead?" And I remember how I reeled back against the open door and stared out with horror-stricken eyes across the common to Dolly Leonard's house, where every window was blazing with calamity. "Dead?" I gasped again. "Dead? What happened?" The postman eyed me with quizzical fatherliness. "Ask your mother," he answered, reluctantly. And I turned and groped my way, leaden-footed, up the stairs, muttering, "Oh, mother, mother, I don't need to ask you." When I got back to my room at last, through a tortuous maze of gaping workmen and sickening flowers, 3 startled girls jumped up to catch me as I staggered across the threshold. I did not faint. I did not cry out. I just sat, huddled on the floor, rocking myself to and fro, and mumbling, as through a mouthful of sawdust, "Dolly Leonard is dead. Dolly Leonard is dead. Dolly Leonard is dead." I will not attempt to describe too fully the scene that followed. There were 7 of us, you know, and we were only 18, and no young person of our acquaintance had ever died before. Indeed, only one aged death had ever disturbed our personal life history, and even that remote catastrophe had sent us scampering to each other's beds a whole winter long, for the individual fear of seeing things at night. Dolly Leonard is dead. I can feel myself yet in that huddled news heap on the floor. A girl at the mirror dropped her hand glass with a shivering crash. Someone on the sofa screamed. The only one of us who was dressed began automatically to unfasten her lace collar and strip off her silken gown, and I can hear yet the soft, lush sound of a folded sash and the strident click of the little French stays that pressed too close on a heaving breast. Then someone threw wood on the fire with a great bang, and then more wood, and we crowded round the hearth and scorched our faces and hands, but we could not get warm enough. Dolly Leonard was not even in our set. She was an older girl by several years, but she was the belle of the village. Dolly Leonard's gowns, Dolly Leonard's parties, Dolly Leonard's lovers were the envy of all womankind, and Dolly Leonard's courtship and marriage were to us the fitting culmination of her wonderful career. She was our ideal of everything that a girl should be. She was good. She was beautiful. She was irresistibly fascinating. She was, in fact, everything that we girlishly longed to be in the revel of a ballroom or the white sanctity of a church. And now she, the bright, the joyous, the warm, was colder than we were, and would never be warm again. Never again. And there were garish flowers downstairs, and music and favours and ices, nasty, shivery ices. And pretty soon a brawling crowd of people would come and dance, because I was 18 and still alive. Into our hideous brooding broke a husky little voice that had not yet spoken. Dolly Leonard told my big sister a month ago that she wasn't a bit frightened, that she had had one perfect year, and a perfect year was well worth dying for, if one had to. Of course she hoped she wouldn't die, but if she did, it was a wonderful thing to die happy. Dolly was queer about it. I heard my big sister telling Mother. Dolly said life couldn't always be at high tide. There was only one high tide in anyone's life, and she thought it was beautiful to go in the full flush before the tide turned. The speaker ended with a harsh sob. Then, suddenly, into our awed silence, broke my mother in full evening dress. She was a very handsome mother. As she looked down on our huddled group, there were tears in her eyes, but there was no shock. I noticed distinctly that there was no shock. "Why, girls," she exclaimed, with a certain terse brightness, "aren't you dressed yet? It's 8 o'clock, and people are beginning to arrive." She seemed so frivolous to me. I remember that I felt a little ashamed of her. "We don't want any party," I answered glumly. "The girls are going home." "Nonsense," said my mother, catching me by the hand and pulling me almost roughly to my feet. "Go quickly and call one of the maids to come and help you dress. Angeline, I'll do your hair. Bertha, where are your shoes? Gertrude, that's a beautiful gown, just your colour. Hurry into it. There goes the bell. Hark, the orchestra is beginning." And so, with a word here, a touch there, a searching look everywhere, Mother marshalled us into line. I had never heard her voice raised before. The colour came back to our cheeks, the light to our eyes. We bubbled over with spirits. Nervous spirits, to be sure, but none the less vivacious ones. When the last hook was fastened, the last glove buttoned, the last curl fluffed into place, Mother stood for an instant tapping her foot on the floor. She looked like a little general. "Girls," she said, "there are 500 people coming tonight from all over the state, and fully 2/3 of them never heard of Dolly Leonard. We must never spoil other people's pleasures by flaunting our own personal griefs. I expect my daughter to conduct herself this evening with perfect cheerfulness and grace. She owes it to her guests, and—" Mother's chin went high up in the air. "I refuse to receive in my house again any one of you girls who mars my daughter's débutante party by tears or hysterics. You may go now." We went, silently berating the brutal harshness of grown people. We went, airily, flutteringly, luminously, like a bunch of butterflies. At the head of the stairs, the music caught us up in a maelstrom of excitement and whirled us down into the throng of pleasure. And when we reached the drawing room and found Mother, we felt as though we were walking on air. We thought it was self-control. We were not old enough to know that it was mostly youth. My débutante party was the gayest party ever given in our town. We 7 girls were like sprites gone mad. We were like fairy torches that kindled the whole throng. We flitted among the palms like will-o'-the-wisps. We danced the toes out of our satin slippers. We led our old boy friends a wild chase of young love and laughter. And because our hearts were like frozen lead within us, we sought, as it were, to warm both hands at the fires of life. We trifled with older men. We flirted, as it were, with our fathers. My débutante party turned out a revel. I have often wondered if my mother was frightened. I don't know what went on in the other girls' brains, but mine were seared with the old world recklessness. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. We die. I had a lover, a boy lover. His name was Gordon. He was 21 years old, and he had courted me with boyish seriousness for 3 years. Mother had always pooh-poohed his love story and said, "Wait, wait. Why, my daughter isn't even out yet. Wait till she's out." And Gordon had narrowed his near-sighted eyes ominously and shut his lips tight. "Very well," he had answered. "I will wait till she is out, but no longer." He was rich. He was handsome. He was well-born. He was strong. But more than all that, he held my fancy with a certain thrilling tenacity that frightened me while it lured me. And I had always looked forward to my débutante party on my 18th birthday with the tingling realization, half joy, half fear, that on that day I should have to settle once and forever with man. I had often wondered how Gordon would propose. He was a proud, high-strung boy. If he was humble and pleaded with the hurt look in his eyes that I knew so well, I thought I would accept him. And if we could get to Mother in the crowd, perhaps we could announce the engagement at supper time. It seemed to me that it would be a very wonderful thing to be engaged on one's 18th birthday. So many girls were not engaged till 19 or even 20. But if he was masterful and high-stepping, as he knew so well how to be, I had decided to refuse him scornfully, with a toss of my head and a laugh. I could break his heart with the sort of laugh I had practiced before my mirror. It is a terrible thing to have a long-anticipated event finally overtake you. It is the most terrible thing of all to have to settle once and forever with man. Gordon came for me at 11 o'clock. I was flirting airily at the time with our village Beau Brummel, who was old enough to be my grandfather. Gordon slipped my little hand through his arm and carried me off to a lonely place in the conservatory. For a second it seemed a beautiful relief to be out of the noise and the glare, and alone with Gordon. But instantly my realization of the potential moment rushed over me like a flood, and I began to tremble violently. All the nervous strain of the evening reacted suddenly on me. "What's the matter with you tonight?" asked Gordon, a little sternly. "What makes you so wild?" he persisted, with a grim little attempt at a laugh. At his words, my heart seemed to turn over within me and settle heavily. It was before the days when we discussed life's tragedies with our best men friends. Indeed, it was so long before that I sickened and grew faint at the very thought of the sorrowful knowledge which I kept secret from him. Again he repeated, "What's the matter with you?" But I could find no answer. I just sat shivering, with my lace scarf drawn close across my bare shoulders. Gordon took hold of a white ruffle on my gown and began to fidget with it. I could see the fine thoughts go flitting through his eyes. But when he spoke again, it was quite commonplacely. "Will you do me a favour?" he asked. "Will you do me the favour of marrying me?" And he laughed. Good God, he laughed. A favour to marry him. And he asked it as he might have asked for a posy or a dance. So flippantly, with a laugh. A favour. And Dolly Leonard lay dead of her favour. I jumped to my feet. I was half mad with fear and sex and sorrow and excitement. Something in my brain snapped, and I struck Gordon, struck him across the face with my open hand, and he turned as white as the dead Dolly Leonard, and went away, oh, very far away. Then I ran back alone to the hall and stumbled into my father's arms. "Are you having a good time?" asked my father, pointing playfully at my blazing cheeks. I went to my answer like an arrow to its mark. "I am having the most wonderful time in the world," I cried. "I have settled with man." My father put back his head and shouted. He thought it was a fine joke. He laughed about it long after my party was over. He thought my head was turned. He laughed about it long after other people had stopped wondering why Gordon went away. I never told anyone why Gordon went away. I might, under certain circumstances, have told a girl, but it was not the sort of thing one could have told one's mother. This is the first time I have ever told the story of Dolly Leonard's death and my debutante party. Dolly Leonard left a little son behind her, a joyous, rollicking little son. His name is Paul Yardley. We girls were pleased with the initials, P.Y. They stand to us for perfect year. Dolly Leonard's husband has married again, and his wife has borne him safely 3 daughters and a son. Each one of my 6 girl chums is the mother of a family. Now and again in my experience, some woman has shirked a duty, but I have never yet met a woman who has dared to shirk a happiness. Duties repeat themselves. There is no duplicate of happiness. I am 58 years old. I have never married. I do not say whether I am glad or sorry. I only know that I have never had a perfect year. I only know that I have never been warm since the night that Dolly Leonard died. End of The Perfect Year by Eleanor A. Hallowell. Recording by Eva Davis.
Chapter 7 of Different Girls. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. Different Girls, Harper's Novelettes. Editha by William Dean Howells. The air was thick with the war-won feeling, like the electricity of a storm which has not yet burst. Editha sat looking out into the hot spring afternoon, with her lips parted and panting with the intensity of the question whether she could let him go. She had decided that she could not let him stay when she saw him at the end of the still, leafless avenue, making slowly up toward the house, with his head down and his figure relaxed. She ran impatiently out on the veranda to the edge of the steps and imperatively demanded greater haste of him with her will before she called aloud to him, "George!" He had quickened his pace in mystical response to her mystical urgence before he could have heard her. Now he looked up and answered, "Well?" "Oh, how united we are!" she exulted, and then she swooped down the steps to him. "What is it?" she cried. "It's war," he said, and he pulled her up to him and kissed her. She kissed him back intensely, but irrelevantly, as to their passion, and uttered from deep in her throat, "How glorious!" "It's war," he repeated, without consenting to her sense of it, and she did not know just what to think at first. She never knew what to think of him. That made his mystery, his charm, all through their courtship, which was contemporaneous with the growth of the war feeling. She had been puzzled by his want of seriousness about it. He seemed to despise it even more than he abhorred it. She could have understood his abhorring any sort of bloodshed. That would have been a survival of his old life when he thought he would be a minister, and before he changed and took up the law. But making light of a cause so high and noble seemed to show a want of earnestness at the core of his being. Not but that she felt herself able to cope with a congenital defect of that sort, and make his love for her save him from himself. Now perhaps the miracle was already wrought in him. In the presence of the tremendous fact that he announced, all trivialities seemed to have gone out of him. She began to feel that. He sank down on the top step and wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, while she poured out upon him her question of the origin and authenticity of his news. All the while, in her duplex emotioning, she was aware that now, at the very beginning, she must put a guard upon herself against urging him, by any word or act, to take the part that her whole soul willed him to take for the completion of her ideal of him. He was very nearly perfect as he was, and he must be allowed to perfect himself. But he was peculiar, and he might very well be reasoned out of his peculiarity. Before her reasoning went her emotioning, her nature pulling upon his nature, her womanhood upon his manhood, without her knowing the means she was using to the end she was willing. She had always supposed that the man who won her would have done something to win her. She did not know what, but something. George Gerson had simply asked her for her love on the way home from a concert, and she gave her love to him, without, as it were, thinking. But now it flashed upon her. If he could do something worthy to have won her, be a hero, her hero, it would be even better than if he had done it before asking her. It would be grander. Besides, she had believed in the war from the beginning. "But don't you see, dearest," she said, "that it wouldn't have come to this if it hadn't been in the order of Providence? And I call any war glorious that is for the liberation of people who have been struggling for years against the cruelest oppression. Don't you think so, too?" "I suppose so," he returned languidly. "But war! Is it glorious to break the peace of the world?" "That ignoble peace! It was no peace at all with that crime and shame at our very gates." She was conscious of parroting the current phrases of the newspapers, but it was no time to pick and choose her words. She must sacrifice anything to the high ideal she had for him, and after a good deal of rapid argument she ended with the climax. "But now it doesn't matter about the how or why. Since the war has come, all that is gone. There are no two sides any more. There is nothing now but our country." He sat with his eyes closed and his head leaned back against the veranda, and he said with a vague smile, as if musing aloud, "Our country, right or wrong." "Yes, right or wrong," she returned fervidly. "I'll go and get you some lemonade." She rose, rustling, and whisked away. When she came back with 2 tall glasses of clouded liquid on a tray and the ice clucking in them, he still sat as she had left him, and she said as if there had been no interruption, "But there is no question of wrong in this case. I call it a sacred war, a war for liberty and humanity, if ever there was one, and I know you will see it just as I do yet." He took half the lemonade at a gulp, and he answered as he set the glass down, "I know you always have the highest ideal. When I differ from you, I ought to doubt myself." A generous sob rose in Editha's throat for the humility of a man so very nearly perfect, who was willing to put himself below her. Besides, she felt that he was never so near slipping through her fingers as when he took that meek way. "You shall not say that. Only for once I happen to be right." She seized his hand in her 2 hands and poured her soul from her eyes into his. "Don't you think so?" she entreated him. He released his hand and drank the rest of his lemonade, and she added, "Have mine too," but he shook his head in answering. I've no business to think so, unless I act so too." Her heart stopped a beat before it pulsed on with leaps that she felt in her neck. She had noticed that strange thing in men. They seemed to feel bound to do what they believed, and not think a thing was finished when they said it, as girls did. She knew what was in his mind, but she pretended not, and she said, "Oh, I'm not sure." He went on as if to himself, without apparently heeding her. "There's only one way of proving one's faith in a thing like this." She could not say that she understood, but she did understand. He went on again. "If I believed, if I felt as you do about this war, do you wish me to feel as you do?" Now she was really not sure, so she said, "George, I don't know what you mean." He seemed to muse away from her as before. "There is a sort of fascination in it. I suppose that at the bottom of his heart every man would like at times to have his courage tested, to see how he would act." "How can you talk in that ghastly way?" "It is rather morbid. Still, that's what it comes to. Unless you're swept away by ambition or driven by conviction. I haven't the conviction or the ambition, and the other thing is what it comes to with me. I ought to have been a preacher after all. Then I couldn't have asked it of myself, as I must, now I'm a lawyer. And you believe it's a holy war, Editha?" He suddenly addressed her. "Or I know you do, but you wish me to believe so too." She hardly knew whether he was mocking or not, in the ironical way he always had with her plainer mind, but the only thing was to be outspoken with him. "George, I wish you to believe whatever you think is true, at any and every cost. If I've tried to talk you into anything, I take it all back." "Oh, I know that, Editha. I know how sincere you are, and how— I wish I had your undoubting spirit. I'll think it over. I'd like to believe as you do, but I don't now. I don't indeed. It isn't this war alone, though this seems peculiarly wanton and needless. But it's every war. So stupid. It makes me sick. Why shouldn't this thing have been settled reasonably?" "Because," she said, very throatily again, "God meant it to be a war." "You think it was God?" "Yes, I suppose that is what people will say." "Do you suppose it would have been war if God hadn't meant it?" "I don't know. Sometimes it seems as if God had put this world into men's keeping to work it as they pleased." "Now, George, that is blasphemy." "Well, I won't blaspheme. I'll try to believe in your pocket providence," he said, and then he rose to go. "Why don't you stay to dinner?" Dinner at Balcom's Works was at 1:00. "I'll come back to supper, if you'll let me. Perhaps I shall bring you a convert." "Well, you may come back on that condition." "All right. If I don't come, you'll understand?" He went away without kissing her, and she felt it a suspension of their engagement. It all interested her intensely. She was undergoing a tremendous experience, and she was being equal to it. While she stood looking after him, her mother came out through one of the long windows onto the veranda with a cat-like softness and vagueness. "Why didn't he stay to dinner?" Because war has been declared," Editha pronounced, without turning. Her mother said, "Oh, my!" and then said nothing more until she had sat down in one of the large Shaker chairs and rocked herself for some time. Then she closed whatever tacit passage of thought there had been in her mind with the spoken words, "Well, I hope he won't go." "And I hope he will," the girl said, and confronted her mother with a stormy exaltation that would have frightened any creature less unimpressionable than a cat. Her mother rocked herself again for an interval of cogitation. What she arrived at in speech was, "Well, I guess you've done a wicked thing, Editha Balcom." The girl said, as she passed indoors through the same window her mother had come out by, "I haven't done anything yet." In her room she put together all her letters and gifts from Gearson, down to the withered petals of the first flower he had offered, with that timidity of his, veiled in that irony of his. In the heart of the packet she enshrined her engagement ring, which she had restored to the pretty box he had brought it her in. Then she sat down, if not calmly yet strongly, and wrote, "George, I understood when you left me, but I think we had better emphasize your meaning that if we cannot be one in everything, we had better be one in nothing. So I am sending these things for your keeping till you have made up your mind. I shall always love you, and therefore I shall never marry anyone else. But the man I marry must love his country first of all, and be able to say to me, 'I could not love thee, dear, so much. Loved I not honour more.' There is no honour above America with me. In this great hour there is no other honour. Your heart will make my words clear to you. I had never expected to say so much, but it has come upon me that I must say the utmost. Editha." She thought she had worded her letter well, worded it in a way that could not be bettered. All had been implied and nothing expressed. She had it ready to send with the packet she had tied with red, white, and blue ribbon, when it occurred to her that she was not just to him, that she was not giving him a fair chance. He had said he would go and think it over, and she was not waiting. She was pushing, threatening, compelling. That was not a woman's part. She must leave him free, free, free. She could not accept for her country or herself a forced sacrifice. In writing her letter she had satisfied the impulse from which it sprang. She could well afford to wait till he had thought it over. She put the packet and the letter by, and rested serene in the consciousness of having done what was laid upon her by her love itself to do, and yet used patience, mercy, justice. She had her reward. Gearson did not come to tea, but she had given him till morning, when, late at night, there came up from the village the sound of a fife and drum, with a tumult of voices, and shouting, singing, and laughing. The noise drew nearer and nearer. It reached the street end of the avenue. There it silenced itself, and one voice, the voice she knew best, rose over the silence. It fell. The air was filled with cheers. The fife and drum struck up with the shouting, singing, and laughing again, but now retreating, and a single figure came hurrying up the avenue. She ran down to meet her lover and clung to him. He was very gay, and he put his arm round her with a boisterous laugh. "Well, you must call me Captain now, or Cap if you prefer. That's what the boys call me. Yes, we've had a meeting at the town hall, and everybody has volunteered, and they selected me for captain, and I'm going to the war, the big war, the glorious war, the holy war, ordained by the pocket providence that blesses butchery. Come along, let's tell the whole family about it. Call them from their downy beds, father, mother, Aunt Hitty, and all the folks." But when they mounted the veranda steps, he did not wait for a larger audience. He poured the story out upon Editha alone. There was a lot of speaking, and then some of the fools set up a shout for me. It was all going one way, and I thought it would be a good joke to sprinkle a little cold water on them. But you can't do that with a crowd that adores you. The first thing I knew I was sprinkling hellfire on them. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. That was the style. Now that it had come to the fight, there were no two parties, there was one country, and the thing was to fight the fight to a finish as quick as possible. I suggested volunteering then and there, and I wrote my name first of all on the roster. Then they elected me. That's all. I wish I had some ice water." She left him walking up and down the veranda while she ran for the ice pitcher and a goblet, and when she came back he was still walking up and down, shouting the story he had told her to her father and mother, who had come out more sketchily dressed than they commonly were by day. He drank goblet after goblet of the ice water without noticing who was giving it, and kept on talking and laughing through his talk wildly. "It's astonishing," he said, "how well the worse reason looks when you try to make it appear the better. Why, I believe I was the first convert to the war in that crowd tonight. I never thought I should like to kill a man, but now I shouldn't care. And the smokeless powder lets you see the man drop that you kill. It's all for the country. What a thing it is to have a country that can't be wrong. But if it is right anyway." Editha had a great, vital thought, an inspiration. She set down the ice pitcher on the veranda floor and ran upstairs and got the letter she had written him. When at last he noisily bade her father and mother, "Well, good night, I forgot I woke you up. I shan't want any sleep myself," she followed him down the avenue to the gate. There, after the whirling words that seemed to fly away from her thoughts and refuse to serve them, she made a last effort to solemnize the moment that seemed so crazy, and pressed the letter she had written upon him. "What's this?" he said. "Want me to mail it?" "No, no, it's for you. I wrote it after you went this morning. Keep it, and read it sometime." She thought, and then her inspiration came. "Read it if ever you doubt what you've done, or fear that I regret your having done it. Read it after you've started." They strained each other in embraces that seemed as ineffective as their words, and he kissed her face with quick hot breaths that were so unlike him that made her feel as if she had lost her old lover and found a stranger in his place. The stranger said, "What a gorgeous flower you are, with your red hair and your blue eyes that look black now, and your face with the colour painted out by the white moonshine. Let me hold you under my chin to see whether I love blood, you tiger lily." Then he laughed Garrison's laugh, and released her, scared and giddy. Within her wilfulness she had been frightened by a sense of subtler force in him, and mystically mastered as she had never been before. She ran all the way back to the house, and mounted the steps panting. Her mother and father were talking of the great affair. Her mother said, "Wa'n't Mr. Garrison in rather of an excited state of mind? Didn't you think he acted curious?" "Well, not for a man who'd just been elected captain and had to set him up for the whole of Company A," her father chuckled back. "What in the world do you mean, Mr. Balcom? Oh, there's Editha." She offered to follow the girl indoors. "Don't come, mother," Editha called, vanishing. Mrs. Balcom remained to reproach her husband. "I don't see much of anything to laugh at." "Well, it's catching. Caught it from Garrison. I guess it won't be much of a war, and I guess Garrison don't think so either. The other fellows will back down as soon as they see we mean it. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. I'm going back to bed myself." Garrison came again next afternoon, looking pale and rather sick, but quite himself, even to his languid irony. "I guess I'd better tell you, Editha, that I consecrated myself to your god of battles last night by pouring too many libations to him down my own throat. But I'm all right now. One has to carry off the excitement somehow." "Promise me," she commanded, "that you'll never touch it again." "What? Not let the cannikin clink? Not let the soldier drink? Well, I promise." "You don't belong to yourself now. You don't even belong to me. You belong to your country, and you have a sacred charge to keep yourself strong and well for your country's sake. I have been thinking all night and all day long." "You look as if you had been crying a little too," he said with his queer smile. "That's all past. I've been thinking and worshipping you. Don't you suppose I know all that you've been through to come to this? I've followed you every step from your old theories and opinions." "Well, you've had a long row to hoe." "And I know you've done this from the highest motives." "Oh, there won't be much pettifogging to do till this cruel war is—" "And you haven't simply done it for my sake. I couldn't respect you if you had." "Well, then we'll say I haven't. A man that hasn't got his own respect intact wants the respect of all the other people he can corner. But we won't go into that. I'm in for the thing now, and we've got to face our future. My idea is that this isn't going to be a very protracted struggle. We shall just scare the enemy to death when it conies to a fight at all. But we must provide for contingencies, Editha. If anything happens to me—" "Oh, George!" She clung to him, sobbing. "I don't want you to feel foolishly bound to my memory. I should hate that, wherever I happen to be." "I am yours for time and eternity, time and eternity." She liked the words. They satisfied her famine for phrases. "Well, say eternity, that's all right. But time's another thing, and I'm talking about time. But there is something. My mother. If anything happens—" She winced, and he laughed. "You're not the bold soldier girl of yesterday." Then he sobered. "If anything happens, I want you to help my mother out. She won't like my doing this thing. She brought me up to think war a fool thing as well as a bad thing. My father was in the Civil War, all through it, lost his arm in it." She thrilled with the sense of the arm round her. What if that should be lost? He laughed as if divining her. "Oh, it doesn't run in the family, as far as I know." Then he added, gravely, "He came home with misgivings about war, and they grew on him. I guess he and mother agreed between them that I was to be brought up in his final mind about it. But that was before my time. I only knew him from my mother's report of him and his opinions. I don't know whether they were hers first, but they were hers last. This will be a blow to her. I shall have to write and tell her." He stopped, and she asked, "Would you like me to write too, George?" "I don't believe that would do. No, I'll do the writing. She'll understand a little if I say that I thought the way to minimize it was to make war on the largest possible scale at once, that I felt I must have been helping on the war somehow if I hadn't helped keep it from coming, and I knew I hadn't. When it came, I had no right to stay out of it." Whether his sophistries satisfied him or not, they satisfied her. She clung to his breast and whispered with closed eyes and quivering lips, "Yes, yes, yes." "But if anything should happen, you might go to her and see what you could do for her. You know, it's rather far off. She can't leave her chair." "Oh, I'll go if it's the ends of the earth. But nothing will happen. Nothing can. She felt herself lifted with his rising, and Gearson was saying, with his arms still round her, to her father, "Well, we're off at once, Mr. Balcom. We're to be formally accepted at the capital, and then bunched up with the rest somehow, and sent into camp somewhere, and got to the front as soon as possible. We all want to be in the van, of course. We're the first company to report to the governor. I came to tell Editha, but I hadn't got round to it." She saw him again for a moment at the capital, in the station, just before the train started southward with his regiment. He looked well, in his uniform, and very soldierly, but somehow girlish too, with his clean-shaven face and slim figure. The manly eyes and the strong voice satisfied her, and his preoccupation with some unexpected details of duty flattered her. Other girls were weeping, but she felt a sort of noble distinction in the abstraction with which they parted. Only at the last moment he said, "Don't forget my mother. It mayn't be such a walk over as I supposed," and he laughed at the notion. He waved his hand to her as the train moved off. She knew it among a score of hands that were waved to other girls from the platform of the car, for it held a letter which she knew was hers. Then he went inside the car to read it, doubtless, and she did not see him again. But she felt safe for him through the strength of what she called her love, what she called her God, always speaking the name in a deep voice, with the implication of a mutual understanding, would watch over him and keep him and bring him back to her. If with an empty sleeve, then he should have 3 arms instead of 2, for both of hers should be his for life. She did not see, though, why she should always be thinking of the arm his father had lost. There were not many letters from him, but they were such as she could have wished, and she put her whole strength into making hers such as she imagined he could have wished, glorifying and supporting him. She wrote to his mother, but the brief answer she got was merely to the effect that Mrs. Gearson was not well enough to write herself, and thanking her for her letter by the hand of someone who called herself, "Yours truly, Mrs. W. J. Andrews." Editha determined not to be hurt, but to write again, quite as if the answer had been all she expected. But before it seemed as if she could have written, there came news of the first skirmish, and in the list of the killed, which was telegraphed as a trifling loss on our side, was Gearson's name. There was a frantic time of trying to make out that it must be, some other Gearson, but the name and the company and the regiment and the state were too definitely given. Then there was a lapse into depths out of which it seemed as if she never could rise again. Then a lift into clouds far above all grief, black clouds that blotted out the sun, but where she soared with him, with George. She had the fever that she expected of herself, but she did not die in it. She was not even delirious, and it did not last long. When she was well enough to leave her bed, her one thought was of George's mother, of his strangely worded wish that she should go to her and see what she could do for her. In the exaltation of the duty laid upon her, it buoyed her up instead of burdening her. She rapidly recovered. Her father went with her on the long railroad journey from northern New York to western Iowa. He had business out at Davenport, and he said he could just as well go then as any other time, and he went with her to the little country town where George's mother lived in a little house on the edge of illimitable cornfields, under trees pushed to a top of the rolling prairie. George's father had settled there after the Civil War, as so many other old soldiers had done, but they were Eastern people, and Editha fancied touches of the East in the June rose overhanging the front door, and the garden with early summer flowers stretching from the gate of the paling fence. It was very low inside the house, and so dim with the closed blinds that they could scarcely see one another. Editha tall and black in her crapes, which filled the air with the smell of their dyes. Her father standing decorously apart, with his hat on his forearm, as at funerals. A woman rested in a deep armchair, and the woman who had let the strangers in stood behind the chair. The seated woman turned her head round and up, and asked the woman behind her chair, "Who did you say?" Editha, if she had done what she expected of herself, would have gone down on her knees at the feet of the seated figure and said, "I am George's Editha," for answer. But instead of her own voice, she heard that other woman's voice saying, "Well, I don't know as I did get the name just right. I guess I'll have to make a little more light in here." And she went and pushed two of the shutters ajar. Then Editha's father said in his public, "Will now address a few remarks" tone, "My name is Balcom, ma'am, Junius H. Balcom, of Balcom's Works, New York. My daughter—" "Oh!" the seated woman broke in, with a powerful voice, the voice that always surprised Editha from Gearson's slender frame. "Let me see you. Stand round where the light can strike on your face." And Editha dumbly obeyed. "So you're Editha Balcom." She sighed. "Yes," Editha said, more like a culprit than a comforter. "What did you come for?" Editha's face quivered, and her knees shook. "I came because George—" She could go no farther. "Yes," the mother said. "He told me he had asked you to come if he got killed. You didn't expect that, I suppose, when you sent him." "I would rather have died myself than done it," Editha said, with more truth in her deep voice than she ordinarily found in it. "I tried to leave him free." "Yes, that letter of yours that came back with his other things left him free." Editha saw now where George's irony came from. "It was not to be read before until I told him so," she faltered. "Of course he wouldn't read a letter of yours under the circumstances till he thought you wanted him to. Been sick?" the woman abruptly demanded. "Very sick," Editha said, with self-pity. "Daughter's life," her father interposed, "was almost despaired of at one time." Mrs. Gearson gave him no heed. "I suppose you would have been glad to die, such a brave person as you. I don't believe he was glad to die. He was always a timid boy that way. He was afraid of a good many things, but if he was afraid, he did what he made up his mind to. I suppose he made up his mind to go, but I knew what it cost him, by what it cost me when I heard of it. I had been through one war before. When you sent him, you didn't expect he would get killed." The voice seemed to compassionate Editha, and it was time. "No," she huskily murmured. "No, girls don't, women don't, when they give their men up to their country. They think they'll come marching back somehow, just as gay as they went, or if it's an empty sleeve or even an empty pantaloon, it's all the more glory, and they're so much the prouder of them. Poor things." The tears began to run down Editha's face. She had not wept till then, but it was now such a relief to be understood that the tears came. "No, you didn't expect him to get killed," Mrs. Gearson repeated, in a voice which was startling like George's again. "You just expected him to kill someone else, some of those foreigners that weren't there because they had any say about it, but because they had to be there, poor wretches, conscripts, or whatever they call them. You thought it would be all right for my George, your George, to kill the sons of those miserable mothers and the husbands of those girls that you would never see the faces of." The woman lifted her powerful voice in a psalm-like note. "I thank my God he didn't live to do it. I thank my God they killed him first, and that he ain't living with their blood on his hands." She dropped her eyes, which she had raised with her voice, and glared at Editha. "What you got that black on for?" She lifted herself by her powerful arms so high that her helpless body seemed to hang limp its full length. "Take it off! Take it off before I tear it from your back." The lady who was passing the summer near Balcom's Works was sketching Editha's beauty, which lent itself wonderfully to the effects of a colorist. It had come to that confidence which is rather apt to grow between artist and sitter, and Editha had told her everything. "To think of your having such a tragedy in your life," the lady said. She added, "I suppose there are people who feel that way about war. But when you consider how much this war has done for the country, I can't understand such people for my part. And when you had come all the way out there to console her, got up out of a sick bed, well." "I think," Editha said magnanimously, "she wasn't quite in her right mind, and so did Papa." "Yes," the lady said, looking at Editha's lips in nature, and then at her lips in art, and giving an empirical touch to them in the picture. "But how dreadful of her! How how vulgar!" A light broke upon Editha in the darkness, which she felt had been without a gleam of brightness for weeks and months. The mystery that had bewildered her was solved by the word, and from that moment she rose from grovelling in shame and self-pity and began to live again in the ideal. End of Editha by William Dean Howells.